Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Robinson. I'm the chair of the Africana Studies Department here at UMBC, and I'd like to thank you for coming out to partake of this panel discussion of this significant historical event. Very significant for many of us in the room because it opened this society up in ways that are indescribable for many of us. And so we want to, at these particular points in history, 40 years, 50 years, what have you, remember these important developments and events in American history, and in particular, Black American history. I'd like to thank the panelists for being here tonight, and they will shortly be introduced. At this time, I'd like to introduce the moderator for the panel discussion tonight, Dr. Tyson Meadows, who's an assistant professor in the political science department here at UMBC, and who's also an affiliate member of our department, the Africana Studies Department. So, Dr. Meadows.
My name is Dr. Tyson Meadows. I'm in the Department of Political Science. And the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is very dear to my heart. I teach American politics, African American politics, in Congress. And I would too like to thank all the guests and the panelists for what will be a wonderful discussion of the Civil Rights Act. I'd just like to give some context, particularly for those individuals who are not old enough to understand that these things don't come out of a vacuum. On July 2nd, 1964, Democrat President Johnson signed into law this most historic act. But the story does not begin there. It's much interesting when unpacking the history. In fact, one might argue that the history began in 1957, when Republican Dwight Pettit supported the Civil Rights Act of 1957. It was aimed to ensure that all blacks could exercise their right to vote by creating a division within the Department of Justice to monitor civil rights abuses and creating a U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. This was the first act passed since 1875, which was eventually nullified by the civil rights cases of 1883. The Southern Democrats, led by LBJ as the Senate leader, gave the bill to the Judiciary Committee. Now that's very important because it was chaired by a Mississippian who was an opponent of overarching federal power. Within that committee, that chair killed the legislation and watered it down. In fact, Strom Thurmond filibustered for about 24 hours, reportedly, on that legislation. When it was eventually passed, black civil rights advocate and former president of the American Political Science Association, Ralph Bunche, reportedly called the bill in 1957 a sham because of its many loopholes. Years later, when Kennedy becomes president, LBJ becomes vice president, some blacks viewed a sense of optimism. But in 1963, when segregationist George Wallace became governor of Alabama, in his inaugural speech declaring segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever, the stage was set once again for civil rights groups. In 1963, the world watched as Bull Connor released his dogs and his fire hoses on marches in Birmingham. We watched in 1963 when Wallace barred the doors to the University of Alabama. We watched in 1963 as Kennedy pledged before Congress that this discrimination was a moral issue that had to be resolved. We watched August 28th on the March of Washington. We watched in horror on November 22nd when Kennedy was assassinated. On November 27th, LBJ addressed the joint session saying, "First, no memorial or quotation or eulogy could be more eloquently honor President Kennedy than the earliest possible passage of the Civil Rights Bill for which he fought so long. We have talked long enough in this country about equal rights. We have talked for 100 years or more. It is now time to write the next chapter and write it in the books of law. In the spring of 1964, George Wallace entered the presidential race to capture the Democratic presidential nomination. And in the state of Maryland, he received 43% during the primary. In June of 1964, 3 civil rights workers disappeared in Mississippi. On July 2nd, 1964, the bill was signed into law, creating the Civil Rights Act of 1964. But in 1964, Fannie Lou Hamer, in her speech to the credentialing committee before the Democratic National Convention, challenged the sitting of an all-white Mississippi delegation. I say that because context matters. And she argued, is America? Is this America? She argued, is this America when we have to turn off our phones or take them off the hook for 5 hours because we are being threatened with violence? This is the act that tried to eliminate those things through the prohibitions against voting rights, exclusions, and discrimination. So now, as I'm joined by the panelists, I just want them to talk about their experiences and for you to think about what that means for there to be living historians, if you will, sitting here tonight. On my left, I'm joined by Judge Kenneth Johnson, who is the hearing examiner for the Baltimore Community Relations Commission and a retired Baltimore City Circuit Court judge. As an attorney, he integrated the Baltimore City Police Department and the fire. He was also head of the U.S. Justice Department Civil Rights Division. To his left is Woody Grant, who is the chief of Quality Assurance and Compliance for the Maryland Department of Education and considered authority on the education components of the Civil Rights Act. To my right immediately is Dwight Pettit, the noted attorney representing Dwight Pettit versus United States case. This was the first time anyone was awarded compensation for past discrimination. And now joining us is Michael Mitchell, the son of late Clarence Mitchell Jr., who considered the 101st senator, and the historical authority on his father's accomplishment. He is an attorney, former Baltimore City Councilman, and former Maryland Senator. So we're going to begin just simply by going down to my left with opening statements before we go to questions.
Thank you. I think Columbia, Mississippi is about 50 miles due north of Gulfport, the water's edge of the Gulf of Mexico. Just got back early yesterday morning and went immediately to Annapolis to start a trial, and did that today and just got back, so I haven't had much sleep. I told my wife, I think it took off because it did land in BWI, and I woke up when it hit the ground. And so if I look a little sleepy, chased an alligator out of my lake that I blocked from the house and couldn't catch him. And so I grew up in segregated United States, segregated Mississippi, in the South. And as Malcolm X always said, that when you speak of the South, you speak of South of the Canadian border, so far as racial segregation. But that's not really what it was. It was white supremacy and oppression, but the code name was racial segregation. And then along came separate people in 1896 in Plessy versus Ferguson. And then things got really, really bad because that spawned the Ku Klux Klan, starting in Tennessee and Mississippi, birthed in Tennessee and Mississippi. And then the White Citizens Council started after Brown versus Board of Education. When I was in high school in Mississippi, I had to walk to school 3 miles every morning, and of course 3 miles back. I say high school, I meant when I started school at age 5, that's what I did. I had to walk past the white school to get there. So when they talked about busing, when I was handling the case of NAACP versus Prince George's County Schools, they were complaining about busing. I said, I wish I could have had a bus to ride. The white folks rode the bus, and when they passed on the dirt roads, we'd have to run into the woods because the driver would slow down and stop, and they'd throw rocks and eggs at it. So busing would have been a good thing for me. It was always the destination of the bus that they complained about when they complained about busing. So I left Mississippi to go to college in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Southern University is now and has been the largest all-black university in the nation, a land-grant college for the education of colored youth. In my second year of law school, I was on April Fool's Day of 1960 because on March 28, 1960, I went downtown Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and sat at a white lunch counter. We got thrown in jail, convicted, and all of those things. And a young man by the name of Thurgood Marshall rescued the Supreme Court. The decision being written by Chief Justice Earl Warren, and the decision occurred December the 11th, 1961. So that was my early involvement. I just might add, if you will allow me to, on May 15th of this year, Southern University called the whom they had expelled, and they gave us all honorary degrees in the field that we would have earned had we not been expelled. And they sort of said, "We're sorry," but it was 44 years after that, and I was able to address the graduating class of lawyers. They had 150 graduating when I was expelled out of law school, and they cut his salary because of me. Of course, he had nothing to do with it, but they cut it anyway. And we were labeled malcontents, and we were told by the governor of Louisiana, Earl K. Long, it was said by the United States, we should go back to Africa, where we came from. We issued a statement which the newspaper would not print, that we didn't come from Africa. Our ancestors did. He didn't come from Europe, his ancestors did. So if he didn't like it in the United States, perhaps he should go back to Europe whence he came. Apparently the governor thought he and his ancestors came from America, but that is another story. At any rate, after my being expelled from Sutherland's law school, I went to Howard. The greatest thing that ever happened to me. I got to be taught and mentored by 6 of the people who argued Brown versus Ford: Spotswood Robinson, Jim Neighbor, Wally Bratton, Lou Redden, and all of those guys were my mentors at Howard University, and they taught me and another student a special course in how you try civil rights constitutional cases. And on my transcript, they had in the South. So they decoded that, and that's where it went to. And from there to the U.S. Army, I was a Judge Advocate General, JAG person. Spent 3 years in Southeast Asia, Chief of Military Justice for the United States Army Pacific Command in Okinawa for 2 years. Served a year on the DMZ in Korea. Got shot at a few times in Vietnam. The uniform was getting shot at because I was wearing the American flag. I was so like the person simply wanted to kill me because I had the captain's father on my shoulder. Nothing personal whatsoever. And returned from Mississippi after 3 years of ducking bullets and hiding and seeking from being killed. The first thing I got called when I got back to Columbia, Mississippi was taken. So I joined the Justice Department immediately. I'd already applied and they'd hired me, but I wouldn't go to work until J. Edgar Hoover cleared me. Now mind you, I had the highest clearance possible that you could have because I had to see everything that the men in the whole Pacific Command. And in the Justice Department, you only needed a secret clearance, and I had much above that. But J. Edgar Hoover had to investigate me again. I have 217 pages of that investigation. Every teacher that ever taught me is right there. Not named, but I know who they were talking about and who was talking. So at any rate, I started in the Justice Department, and the first week they assigned me my first assignment to be the head. And then from Birmingham, I got promoted to the head of all of Georgia. So I saw a few things, and it was Brown versus Board of Education, the Rights Act of 1964, the Voters' Rights Act of 1965, and the Fair Housing Act of 1968. And I'm still alive, I believe.
It certainly gives me pleasure to speak of these things before youngsters who were blessed not to have to experience the things that we did. However, I do believe that the person I am is as a result of the experiences I had in the cornerstone of massive resistance. I'm a native of Virginia, southeastern Virginia, the cornerstone of massive resistance. I'm a product of 12 years of segregated public education. An A1 education, by the way. A product of Virginia University. At each level of my growth, at no time can I ever remember not being reminded by someone, one, that I was black. And of course, as time passed, they added male to that. Being a black male, being a black person in the United States of America is something that you're conscious of 24/7. And frankly, it keeps you on your toes. Much went on, as you heard from our moderator and from Judge Johnson, that led up to the promulgation of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Many people died because of what they believed in. They believed in the Constitution. They believed in those documents that have said to us we are free in this country. They believed in it, though we were not living that kind of experience. We were not living. There were limits on much of what we were attempting to do. However, a gentleman came along by the name of Martin Luther King, who had some experiences with Mahatma Gandhi, studying a process and a model of protest that worked for him in India. King decided that he would begin speaking to youth around the country. I'm a graduate of Virginia Union University, a land-grant college. Dr. King was a visiting professor in humanities there, who came to us, spoke to us, saying that there's a way to get this thing done without a great deal of injury. There's a way to do what we need to do. It's called passive, nonviolent resistance. We were put into a kind of training mode for a number of months, and following what happened in A&T College and University in North Carolina, A&T University now, we began to go into restaurants in the city of Richmond, the capital of Virginia, to sit in until people served us. Of course, it never happened. Fortunately, and you know, the first day it happened, I don't think any of us had a dime to pay for what they were serving us. So the NAACP decided they'd better give us at least $5. However, during those times, how the kind of strength that we were able to be enhanced by, strength that came from knowing what we were doing was right, knowing that we were not seeking to the levels of violence that the forces who were surrounding us from time to time, attempting to frighten us away from our objective. We picketed stores for 2 years. 2 years. We walked into the department stores and restaurants with shopping bags. Economic boycotting helped. It urged folks who felt that otherwise they were not going to acquiesce. They weren't bothered with niggers. We decided that we were right. We had the ability, we had the numbers, and we had the support. In those days, the National Urban League, the Student Nonviolent Party, the SCLC, the Southern Leadership Christian Organizations, we were supported by Thurgood Marshall. I think Mr. Marshall bailing college kids out of jail, going to court defending college people who had decided that we were sick and tired, but we were not going to be sick and tired anymore. Civil rights at that time was an activity that anyone worth his salt would engage in. And I want to say to you right now that the racism that we were coming against is still with us. Far more subtle than ever. You know that all too often we tend to want to forget. It's okay to be friendly, loving, but it's not okay to forget where you've come from, where you were. It's the of those who've gone before us, those without whom we would not have gotten the Civil Rights Act of 1964. That Civil Rights Act bailed out a number of the hindrances. I was 21 years of age. At 21, I could not register until I paid my capitation tax. Everything was done to hinder us from being full-fledged citizens. Some were asked or required to tell how many bubbles there was on a cake of soap. As a kind of literacy test, I assume, some kind of test. These kinds of obnoxious hindrances were placed before us as requirements. We who were born full-fledged citizens of the country, not until 64, not until our people decided we were no longer going to take the things that we had taken out of homage to our forefathers. We decided that, I want to say to you today, those of you today, when you see you need to mention to anyone who's participating in inequities what you see them doing and what you think they should be about.
Good evening. And thank you here this evening. This is a very, very important occasion that we observe, and to be at the observance of Frederick Douglass Awards at the University of Maryland University campus, which I was the recipient of that award. So it's very timely that I have the opportunity to be here this evening. I was one who was probably totally oblivious to what was taking place in America as a child. I lived in a place in Baltimore County where I was very happy because the only exposure that I had to racism sits in the peninsula. And we have a river that runs between Turner Station and Dundalk. And the white kids would come over and throw stones at us in their boats. And we didn't have boats, but we tried to throw stones back to their side in Dundalk. So therefore, with this non-contact with racist America at that time, about 13 to 14 years old, 13 years old, and one day my father tells me, he's an engineer at Fort Holabird, we're moving to a place that he's been transferred called Aberdeen, Maryland. This was a horrendous. I was at Solace Point High School. I was living a great life. I was athletically involved. Academically, I had a great social life. And all of a sudden, he took me to Aberdeen, which there was nothing there but skunks. And so all of a sudden, I was thrown into a totally different environment. Total ignorance and total non-knowledge of what was happening in the world. To be enrolled at the Aberdeen High School, where I was promptly denied admission. And this is 1958, 4 years after Brown versus Board of Education. He retained at that point in time one of the outstanding lawyers, and when they mention lawyers, I have to go first to the local lawyers, who were champions in the civil rights movement and the formulation of the Civil Rights Act. But my lawyer was Juanita Jackson Mitchell, Michael's mother. And she was also in the case along with Tucker Daring, Thurgood Marshall, and Jack Greenberg. And so therefore I became... There's another thing that was taking place while this integration process was in movement. My father was the first African-American hired in Maryland as an engineer. And he was the only one at that point in time working at certain bases or certain laboratories at Aberdeen Proving Ground. And so I didn't receive the impact as a child. Because I went into the school, I played football, and I had a great time, a great life. Athletes are sort of exempt from a lot of things that other people. The price of what he had done. He was advised in no uncertain terms that he would never be promoted again while he was there. And so the cycle took place. He endured what I did not have to endure. He endured being bored on a daily basis. He endured Confederate flags that were pasted in his office after he would leave. When he came in the morning, that you would light it would play Dixie. He had his work that went to the Library of Congress that he wrote and that he published, which went to the Library of Congress under his other co-employees and not his name. He endured this tragic situation for several years. While I had the opportunity to finish high school at Aberdeen, I had to go to Tyson and meet some of the great people there. Stokely Carmichael, Michael H. Rapp Brown, that I'm matriculated with, Cleve Sutton. I had the opportunity to go to law school where I also enjoyed those outstanding professors that Judge Johnson talks about. And I had the opportunity to take my father's case, which was still at that time. Mrs. Mitchell had taken it as far as she could take it to the time the law had not developed. Congress had not passed Title VII, which is a direct descendant of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. It had passed Title VII in terms of the 64 Act, but it was said by the good doctor here, it had not passed Title VII in the federal government. Congress would act in 1972. This suit would be filed in 1971. So I had the opportunity to argue that case before 7 learned judges in the United States Court of Claims, and in a 4-3 decision prevailed. 4 grades of promotion, received $100,000 in back pay, and was able to work out his days at Aberdeen Proving Ground with the label of one who had received some justice and equity from the system. And so what happened to my father, or with my father, was one of my greatest privileges in terms of civil rights. And when I talk about civil rights, therefore, I always talk about him as being the prime mover in terms of me developing that ambition to, in fact, become a lawyer in the civil rights movement. And so I would come out through the observance of Mrs. Mitchell, through the interactions with Tucker Daring, through the knowledge of Thurgood Marshall, and through the interaction of those great attorneys, and also the ambitions of my father, and had the opportunity to go into the private practice. Because this is we've done several panels together, and this is such an interwoven group. I came back home, National Litigation Office of the Small Business Administration, and was denied admission to the Maryland Bar. At that time, they were passing maybe 1 at a time, and if you were lucky, maybe 2 at a time. But I think it was closer to 1, it wasn't Michael. And it was Kenneth L. Johnson in the suit to integrate and to change the discrimination in the Maryland Bar exam back in the early 70s. And so I had a great opportunity to be one of those persons who were in fact, or who was in fact on the line, as I said before, as a progeny of the 64 Civil Rights Act, in terms of bar exams, in terms of open housing, in terms of public accommodations, and particularly happy to be here with you tonight.